Hello everyone, my name is Emily and my voice still sounds like death because I'm recording all this audio at the same time. Aren't I the smartest? Today I'm going to be teaching you about a watercolor technique that I feel like every single watercolor artist needs to know. Though I also think this is one of the most difficult techniques to master and I am not there yet by far. However, I do think I have a strong enough grasp on it to be able to show you and dictate how to do it and how to practice it. So here I have some of my Patreon rewards for my $30 tier, my legendary babes. They receive a different artist trading card every single month, and every month has a different theme. I believe I forgot to mention the theme of the trading card of the month in May, but the theme was Sanrio Death Punch, which basically means Emily's going to draw a bunch of Sanrio-esque characters having really demented stuff happening to them. Hooray! If you're curious and want to know more about my Patreon, please follow the link in the description down below. I only have 2 tiers at the moment. I've got the $5 Basic Babes tier or the $30 Legendary Babes tier. So check that out if you are so inclined. Now there's not really a name for this technique, so to speak. It's akin to flash painting, which is commonly used in tattoo design, specifically the Americana tattoo style. And in those instances, you use ink instead of watercolor to create shadows and depth to the painting. The actual execution of how you create those shadows is one and the same. It's basically the exact same thing. But for watercolor, it doesn't really have a name. So I'm really just going to call it the wash and pull technique. The best example I have is of this little puppy opening this envelope and this ghosty dude is busting out of the envelope. So let's go ahead and start with the background, which is essentially just a big round blob, which I feel is the best way to practice because you don't have to be too accurate with your initial color splaying. So for this technique, you want your applied paint to stay wet for the longest period of time possible, because if it's wet, it is far more malleable than when it is dry. Part of this technique can involve messing with your paint after it's dried, but we're not there yet. Starting with the first section, first visualize how far you want your paint to fade out into nothingness. All this technique is really doing is creating a soft gradient. Once you've kind of visualized where you want your paint to fade out to, dial it back by about 1 centimeter, and that's where you're going to lay your initial paint swatch. Once you've done that, quickly either go rinse off the brush you were using or pick up a clean brush. I prefer to have 2 things of water on my desk, 1 dirty, 1 clean. Some people even like to have 3 so that they have perfect untouched water, but to me 2 is fine. Instead of switching brushes, I like to just take the brush I was using, clean off the bulk of the paint in the dirty water, and then swish it through again in the clearer water. You could even purchase a water brush and use that to splay your colors. That is like the easiest, most straightforward, quickest way to do it. So once your brush is clean or you have your water or extra brush, go back to your swatch with a wet brush and drag it across the edges of your swatch. It's going to take you time to figure out the proper water to brush ratio for this step. It's a learning curve and it may not happen right away. If it doesn't happen right away, don't get frustrated. Just keep practicing. Just make a bunch of blobs on a piece of paper and do it over and over and over again. Once you've dragged your brush along the edge, quickly get a dry brush or dry off the brush that you're using. Go back in, pull your brush over very similarly to how you did with a wet brush, but this time with a dry brush over the outermost edge of the water. Because watercolor is a wet medium, the pigment, the paint, will always go where water is. What you're doing by placing a wet brush along the edges of a wet pigment swatch is pulling the pigment from the outermost layer of the swatch into the water. That is then diluting the pigment, creating a gradient. However, if you don't work with the water and just leave it as is, the pigment from the wet swatch will continue to flow into the water, creating another hard edge wherever the water has stopped. So to remedy that, you take a dry brush and begin to create a gradient where the water flows. So the idea is that the outermost edge of everything is the driest place. Then as you get a little closer, it gets a little less dry. Then as you get a little closer, it gets a little less dry. So there's less ability for the pigment to flow and create hard edges. There's also a pretty steep learning curve when it comes to working with a dry brush. For a lot of watercolor artists, we are so used to working with wet water all the time. It's a little counterintuitive to introduce dryness into the painting. You can use a dry brush at any point while you're working on a watercolor painting to pull water and pigment back out of the painting. I do it all the time. So what happens if you do that and it's not exactly perfect? Because this is kind of where I am on my watercolor journey. Not every single time that I use this wash and pull technique does it come out a perfect gradient. Now, before I used to panic and overwork the edges while they were still wet. You do want to work with the edges just a little bit as they're beginning to dry, but if you overwork them while they're still in their moist state, you are going to totally overextend where you wanted the pigment to flow. So instead, it's okay to let the pigment dry, so long as the outermost edge isn't too dark. If it's too dark, this step won't work. You can see here that although very faint, there is some edginess to the painting still. And there's nothing wrong with that. In a lot of circumstances, I would just leave this as is, but for the sake of the lesson, I'm going to tell you how to fix it. Now that it's been dried, get a wet, clean brush with a fair amount of water on it and begin to lightly scrub the edges in a circular motion. If you scrub it too hard, it could pull up the paper or mess with the paper sizing, and you really don't want to do that. Just a gentle scrub and circular motions is all you should need. Then take a dry paper towel or a dry rag and soak up the excess water as you go. And depending on the staining power of the paint you have used, it should pull up those edges nicely. Keep in mind every single paint, depending on what pigments are used, will have a different staining power, but that's why, like I said before, make sure the edges aren't too dark, because regardless of staining power, the pigment still should pull up enough to create that gradient. Now let's try this technique on a much smaller and more accurate scale. The main difference here is where I'm laying my pigment and where I want color and where I do not want color to be. For the ghost, I want to have a nice white outline all the way around him, so I'm applying pigment just below the actual line art. I apply the pigment. I come in with my clean, wet brush to pull the pigment away. Then I come in with my dry brush to begin the gradient process. In certain areas, I wait for the section to dry, and then I go back in with a clean, wet brush to slightly scrub up those hard edges. If for some reason my raspy voice has been distracting you and you just like to focus on the technique itself, here are a few more examples without the commentary. This technique and the structure of this technique is really important because this is how you ultimately blend your watercolors. Sometimes it feels when you're a beginner that watercolors are this impossibly complex medium, but in reality, it's just a combination of really simple techniques. The techniques are simple in structure, but difficult to master in practice. So if it helps you at all, there are just a handful of watercolor techniques that you really need to know in order to progress in your watercolor journey. It's just a matter of practicing those techniques. If you guys would like me to turn this into a series and explain some other watercolor techniques and how I apply them to my own art, please let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, in case you guys didn't know, I have some really cool designs in my RedBubble store currently. If you guys have ever wanted to own some Emily Artful merch, I guess it's not really merch because it doesn't have like in-jokes, it doesn't have anything on it that pertains to the videos, but I have some really cool designs in my RedBubble right now, and click the link in the description if you guys are at all interested in buying a shirt or a backpack with something that I have drawn on it. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and don't forget to stay out of trouble. See you guys later.
This video was brought to you by viewers like you. If you'd like to support the channel, please go to www.patreon.com/EmilyArtful. Thanks again for watching.